All right, well, let's jump back and talk just a little bit more about the unitary executive, because I think it's a very interesting concept and political theory, and it's not new. And that's important because if you saw the movie Vice about Vice President Dick Cheney.
Saw that.
You did see it?
I did.
Apparently, I didn't see it. So apparently there was a scene in there where Vice President Cheney and somebody else, and I don't remember if it was Attorney General Barr at that time.
I think it could have been because I remember seeing him in the movie. Yep.
Okay, where they were sitting around conspiring to come up with the concept of the unitary executive where all power could be placed in a single man in this country or something like that. And that's absolute nonsense. This was actually a concept.
I remember that scene vaguely.
You do?
I
Okay.
think so.
So that was in there, and Attorney General Barr made reference to it, but that was not a correct reading of historically how the concept came about and when it came about. Now, the concept of the unitary executive means the executive power is in one person, and it's not all the power in the government, but the executive power. Now, there are certain functions that just don't lend themselves to having councils and don't lend themselves to having a number of people that you have to discuss and you have to build a consensus to get anything done. And among those are the powers such as faithfully executing and enforcing the laws. I mean, that requires essentially a unity of purpose. You can't be sitting around always debating what's the proper way to enforce the laws or execute the laws, but you need someone who believes that they understand them and who will do what it takes in that person's mind to enforce them. And it's important to remember that the president's elected every 4 years, and that was part of the concept, that you can have this unitary power in one person who is regularly elected on a national level. And it's the only person who's elected by the entire nation at once. You know, when we go to elect our senators and our congresspeople, it's either a statewide election or a smaller congressional district election. But other functions that lend themselves especially to the idea of a single person handling them are foreign policy, because you can't have all of these. Well, look what we're having now. The discussions are being leaked. All these other people are kind of involved in the discussions. Now, they're part of the executive branch, but they're not performing their duties and keeping these deliberations secret and confidential, which is required of them, which they're supposed to do. You've got guys like Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who's part of the impeachment proceedings, and he's going around the backside telling, like the Ukrainians, don't listen to the president, don't do what he says, and other things like that. We'll talk a little more when we come back.
We are back on the Morgan Streetman Show, and Morgan, you were explaining a little bit more about the unification of the executive powers. Yes.
Yeah, in a single person. And I thought one part in particular, I mean, you got to go out there and listen to Bill Barr's speech. One part in particular, though, I really enjoyed, and I'm going to kind of read it to you or paraphrase it to you. But he said, because, you know, he's being attacked right now for this speech, saying it was highly political. But it really wasn't political. It was an education in civics and an understanding of where this concept came from. And in fact, he spoke against the politicization of the entirety of what the government is supposed to do. And that politicization is encapsulated in the idea of the resistance movement. You know, as he said immediately after President Trump won the election, his opponents, the Democrats, and he didn't say Democrats, I added that, but they inaugurated what they called the resistance, and they rallied around an explicit strategy of using every tool and maneuver that they could to sabotage the functioning of President Trump's administration. As Attorney General Barr said, resistance is the language used to describe insurgency against rule imposed by an occupying military power. So even their language is loaded up with this idea of resisting an occupation, an illegitimate military invasion, which clearly that completely disrespects the fact that President Trump won the election. I mean, 63 million people, or however many it was exactly, voted for him. a bunch of people voted for him. Now, some people didn't like him, and a bunch of people voted against him also. But the point is that a lot of people in this country voted for him, and under the Electoral College, enough voted for him to be the legitimate, duly elected president. Now, Attorney General Barr went on to cover the fact that instead of viewing themselves as the loyal opposition, as has always been done in this country, when your party did not prevail in the presidential election or in other elections, you tended to view yourself as loyal opposition, but now they view themselves as the resistance. And any tool that they can use to frustrate the functioning of government is legitimate in the resistance. So he said a prime example of this is the Senate's advise and consent role for presidential nominees.
So we have 5 more years of resistance, I guess.
Well, it's an interesting question because I have to tell you, I think the country is still pretty equally divided 50-50. Now, my judgment is that there's no way that President Trump could lose the election, but certainly I talked to some smart people, some of whom I really respect, and some folks, and these are not D.C. insiders, but some folks said, look, they think it's essentially President Trump's going to lose no matter who the Democrats nominate because the Democrats are so fired up because our country is divided essentially right down the middle in terms of overall population, how each side feels. And, of course, the other thing you have to think about is some of these changes that we've seen recently, for instance, in Florida with the restoration of felon voting rights. Now, I'm sure that the ex-felons, will not vote as a voting bloc 100% one way or the other, but I'm equally as sure that they're going to lean Democrat. And, of course, that's 1 million people who were not allowed to vote who live in the state of Florida who now will be allowed to vote in the next election. So how, if you remember, some elections in our state of Florida have been decided by about 500 votes, statewide elections. I'm thinking back to Bush v. Gore. So one wonders what
Florida's key.
Yeah, and one wonders what effect is it going to be to add 1 million new voters who probably lean, I'm guessing, fairly heavily Democrat. And, of course, you've got all the voter fraud issues as well. But to jump back to Attorney General Barr's speech, the advise and consent role that the Senate has traditionally fulfilled and is constitutionally supposed to fulfill is designed to keep unqualified nominees from passing. However, that's not how the Senate is using that role. Instead, they're using it to frustrate every nominee, even well-qualified nominees. And just to give an example, in order to proceed to a vote, the Senate has been forced to invoke what's called cloture, which means you would need 60 votes to stop the vote from proceeding 236 times in President Trump's first term of office. Just to compare that, how many times was the Senate forced to seek cloture on President Obama's nominees during his first term? 17. And how about during President George W. Bush's first term? 4 times. You can see this method is increasing in use, and particularly under President Trump, it's up more than 1,000%. And that's completely unheard of in history and is completely inappropriate unless you view every action through the lens of the idea that you are resisting some kind of military occupation, and that's the position that the Democrats have taken. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.